Hello, I'm Lena Cowan Orland. I'm a fellow at the Hagler Institute for Advanced Study at Texas A&M University. I am very pleased and honored to be asked to take part in the Shakespeare Festival at Buenos Aires. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and for giving me a chance to talk about my research into Shakespeare biography. Thank you so much for inviting me to give an overview of the biography I've written about William Shakespeare, the private man. Let me begin with where biography started for Shakespeare. That was in 1709, almost a century after his death. Shakespeare's first biographer, Nicholas Rowe, was also the first editor of his plays. Rowe collected oral history about Shakespeare because he believed that knowledge of an author was helpful for understanding an author's works. He reported that Shakespeare was the son of a merchant in Stratford-on-Avon. On course to be a merchant himself, Shakespeare thought fit to marry while he was yet very young, and he had 3 children. But at some point, he fell in with some bad company and stole a deer from a Sir Thomas Lucy. Lucy prosecuted him so severely that Shakespeare fled to London. There, he established himself as an actor and writer. He accumulated sufficient wealth that he was eventually able to retire to a life of leisure in Stratford. At age 53, he died and was buried in Stratford's Holy Trinity Church, with a monument nearby. All this we knew in 1790. From here on, there was more directed research and a series of archival discoveries. Not only is there a grave for Shakespeare, in 1763, Philip Nichols pointed out that there's one for Shakespeare's wife, too. The math shows that she was born in 1556. He was not born until 1564. He was 8 years younger. Philip Nichols also published Shakespeare's will, with Shakespeare leaving Anne Hathaway nothing but a brown best bed. 30 years later, it was revealed that Nichols had mistranscribed the will. In fact, Anne Shakespeare inherited not a brown best bed, but her husband's second best bed. In 1836, a document was discovered in which 2 men swore that the union of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway satisfied all the legal requirements for a church wedding. Put the date of this marriage bond, November 27, 1582, together with the baptismal date of Shakespeare's first child, May 26, 1583, and Anne Hathaway was 3 months pregnant when Shakespeare married her. It looked like a shotgun wedding. Put the bond together with the age difference, and it looked like a scheming older woman had sexually entrapped a naive 18-year-old boy. Put the enforced marriage together with the churlish bequest of an old bed, and it looked like Shakespeare resented Anne Hathaway from beginning to end. By the 1800s, no one cared about the deer stealing story anymore. They were confident that Shakespeare left Stratford not because he stole a deer, but because he was running away from the wife he despised. This was said to have been a proven fact. Every sonnet and every play that depicts unhappy relationships was presumed to be autobiographical. I began with the premise that I couldn't possibly know when Shakespeare wrote autobiographically, if he wrote autobiographically. That left the historical record, the archives that had already given us Shakespeare's will and his marriage bond, but that had more to reveal. In this short talk, I do show a few of these documents just so you get a sense of the archival context. The archives are particularly rich with regard to Shakespeare's father. As a civic leader in Stratford, John Shakespeare appears frequently in town records. To my mind, this is where Shakespeare's story begins. We already had two accounts for why Shakespeare left Stratford. He stole a deer, he hated his wife. But there is a third way of looking at this. He elected not to follow in his father's footsteps. The deer-stealing legend and the theory of a shotgun wedding both depict Shakespeare as a victim of his own ill-considered adolescent behavior. He made himself susceptible to coercion, either by Sir Thomas Lucy or by Anne Hathaway. His solution was to run away, whereupon he fortuitously fell into a life in the theater. By contrast, what we find when we understand his father's story is that Shakespeare made a life choice purposefully and with self-awareness, and that choice made his writing career possible. One thing Shakespeare learned from his father was ambition. John Shakespeare was a Snitterfield farm boy who traveled 4 miles to the market town of Stratford to undertake a crafts apprenticeship. It was the 16th century equivalent of being the first in his family to attend college. Training as a leather worker and glove maker, he quit the subsistence life of small farming and seized an opportunity to make, save, and invest money. He married a woman who was a minor heiress, owner of a piece of land called Asbies. He was so successful as a businessman that he was able to buy property himself. By the time his oldest son William was born in 1564, he was already a town alderman. Shakespeare was 4 when his father was elected bailiff, Stratford's name for its mayor. And Shakespeare's earliest memories may be of his father wearing a gown trimmed in fur, ushered ceremoniously in civic processions, escorted to his seat in the first pew in Holy Trinity Church, reading public proclamations, and serving as the Queen's own avatar in adjudicating legal disputes. 9 years later, John Shakespeare was charged in the Queen's own courts for illegal business practices. He stopped attending town meetings and went into what was called hiding. It has been speculated that John Shakespeare withdrew from public life because he was a religious recusant. And indeed, in 1592, he was reported to the central government for failure to attend church. However, the purpose of that report was to identify men and women who were Spanish sympathizers. Amid fears of another Spanish invasion, this was a terror watch list with names broken into categories from most alarming to least. Some of those named were known to be intransigent papists. They had even traveled to continental seminaries or had secretly harbored Catholic priests. Further down the list, there were people who admittedly were absent from church, but who had credible reasons for their absence. They were old or ill, or, like John Shakespeare, seriously in debt. Debtors were subject to arrest by sheriffs and their officers, but because it was illegal for sheriffs to enter people's homes to arrest them, sheriffs conducted their sting operations at the churches where people were expected every Sunday. For government officials to identify John Shakespeare as a man who avoided church in order to avoid arrest was their way of saying that he was not a recusant. In the 1570s, 1580s, and 1590s, John Shakespeare was sued repeatedly by men to whom he owed money. Repeatedly, Warwickshire sheriffs were charged to jail him and seize his goods to satisfy his creditors. He would never fully recover from the business collapse that began just as Shakespeare turned 13. At 13, Shakespeare knew not only that his father's way of life had failed, but also that he was on the same life path as his father. Living in a market town, he was scheduled to be apprenticed at age 17 in a mercantile craft. Local oral history suggests that he was to have trained as a butcher. This is entirely plausible. His father dressed animal hides, and he's likely to have secured Shakespeare a place with one of the butchers who provided him with those hides. Although Shakespeare's own apprenticeship indenture is lost, we know from other examples that he would have been expected to work for a butcher for 7 years until he was age 24. Then he could expect to work 2 or 3 more years as a hired man until he'd saved enough money to be able to open his own butcher shop. The indenture articles also spelled out other rules. He had to be obedient to his master. He had to protect his master's goods. In addition, quote, fornication he shall not commit, matrimony he shall not contract, unquote. Fornication and matrimony were deal breakers. We know that Shakespeare committed fornication about 3 months before he married. He was 18, probably having served no more than a year as an apprentice when he committed the acts that broke his terms of indenture. He could have just run away. An astonishing number of unhappy apprentices did. Instead, he found a creative alternative. I believe that Shakespeare knew where his talent lay and saw little purpose investing 9 or 10 years setting up to be a butcher. The early marriage was the key to his becoming an actor and writer. His father left Snitterfield for Stratford even more ambitiously. He left Stratford for London. London was the center of the commercial theater. Other actors and playwrights settled in the city with their families. Shakespeare spent his London years living in rented lodgings and kept his permanent address in Stratford. The wedding was a sign that he and his wife were ready to set up their own household. It may also have meant that, with his father burdened by debt, he became head of the larger Shakespeare family. The house that Shakespeare bought in 1597, New Place, was big enough not only for his wife and 3 children, but also for his parents and his 2 unmarried brothers. The whole Shakespeare clan may have moved there after Stratford was devastated by fires in 1595 and 1596. The family house on Henley Street may have been one of more than 200 Stratford buildings that suffered fire damage in those years. The lost house, New Place, was also large enough for cottage industry. Documents about life at New Place are few because most of the surviving records from Stratford are town records, and Shakespeare was not involved in town government as his father had been. Elsewhere in Stratford archives, though, we encounter information about other houses and especially other married women who opened businesses out of their houses. For example, a woman named Elizabeth Quiney is fairly well documented because her husband was a civic leader. Quiney ran her own household, took in lodgers, supervised servants, processed corn to produce malt for beer, imported and sold fine foods and wines, hosted civic events, managed rental properties, and conducted financial transactions that involved borrowing and lending, as well as retail sales. Through her career, we learn how to read the few scattered records that remain about New Place and Anne Shakespeare. Elizabeth Quiney shows us what we should be open to discovering about the working lives of early modern women. And with her help, we can deduce that Anne ran her own household, took in lodgers, supervised servants, processed corn for malt, brewed beer, cultivated orchards and vines, hosted civic events, managed investment properties, and conducted financial transactions that involved borrowing and lending, as well as retail sales. Shakespeare was eventually able to retire to Stratford to live off the rents and incomes of lands he had purchased. This was largely because of his London earnings, which included his share of profits from the theatrical company for which he acted and for which he wrote. But Anne Shakespeare's Stratford earnings also contributed to the family's financial success. Shakespeare's emotional relationship with his wife will always be hidden from us. What seems clear, however, is that the relationship served them well. The marriage made it possible for him to work as a writer, and together he and his wife built a life as provincial gentry. Moreover, when you read Shakespeare's will in the context of other wills from the period, you will find no evidence of his supposed hostility towards her. It has been said that the second best bed was a bequest that was designed to disinherit her, the way people would cut someone off with a shilling in the 18th century. That was impossible in the 17th century, when women were protected by dower law. This ensured that Anne would receive 1/3 of all the rents and incomes from the lands the couple had purchased during their marriage. Because these properties were extensive, she was very well provided for. The marriage bond that was discovered back in 1836 has an additional significance in this respect. Dower law was automatically and irreversibly engaged by church wedding. A second thing to know about Shakespeare's will is that beds are mentioned in wills more than any other household goods. They were usually described in terms of their relative value. Best bed, second best bed, third best bed, worst bed. It was a standard way of identifying beds, not an insulting way. A principal heir might receive a whole house, a valuable horse, a best cloak, and a worst bed. The best bed, which usually stood in a guest bedchamber, was often a bequest to the house rather than to an individual. Shakespeare's best bed would have remained in New Place with his principal heir, his daughter Susanna, meant to descend with the house. Like any man of property, Shakespeare devoted most of his will to distributing lands and houses, not furniture or objects. There were just a very few exceptions. He gave his wearing apparel to a sister who had sons, a silver gilt bowl to his daughter Judith, the sword that was symbolic of his status as a gentleman to a gentleman friend, and a bed to his wife. The fact that special gifts were so few suggests that each may have had a personal or sentimental significance. Before he died, Shakespeare probably commissioned his own funerary monument. This was common at the time. His frontally facing portrait sculpture, standing half height within an architectural niche, was an uncommon type that was seen for just 30 or 35 years between 1610 and 1645. More popular types showed men and women lying in death, or men and women kneeling in prayer in preparation for death. Shakespeare's type was about the lived life rather than death. It celebrated men of accomplishment with naturalistic portraits painted to resemble the sitter while alive. The niches provided space for the figures to clasp books, read, lecture. A rare variation on this type, showing the figures with cushions at their waist, was associated exclusively with the distinguished scholars of Oxford University. For years, Shakespeare's biographers have worried over the fact that he never attended university. Our old friend Nicholas Rowe said that he didn't even complete the grammar school program because of his father's troubled financial circumstances. But local oral history also tells us that during all those years that Shakespeare lived and worked in London, he returned home to Stratford at least once a year. It was a 3 or 4 day trip, and a common stopping place was Oxford. He's said to have stayed in the house of an Oxford couple who maintained drinking rooms for university folk. This was before there were college common rooms and before colleges were closed off with fences and gates. In early 17th century Oxford, Shakespeare would have been free to mingle with Oxford's men of learning. The similarity of his funeral monument to those found in college chapels suggests that he also attended sermons by the leading intellectuals of the day. The year before Shakespeare died, a tomb maker named Nicholas Johnson came to Stratford to install a monument to Shakespeare's good friend John Combe. Nicholas Johnson is known to have created other half-height portrait memorials, including this one, done in London for a man who died the same year Shakespeare did, in 1616. The monument survived the Great Fire of London, although the fire stripped off the polychrome paint that makes these portraits so lively. To set the price for his monument, Shakespeare would have told Nicholas Johnson what sort of monument he wanted. The monument he had in mind would have been those he'd seen in Oxford, cushion and all. What Nicholas Johnson would have seen was Shakespeare's face and a chance to sculpt his subject from the life. The idea that Shakespeare commissioned his own monument is true to the story of a man who knew what he wanted to do with his life. At the outset, his marriage showed that he had a strong belief in his own talents. At the end, his monument showed that he had a strong sense of what he had achieved with his talents. This is how he wanted to be remembered, with a quill in hand and paper at the ready. Thank you. I should say that there's no evidence for the idea either that he was apprenticed or that he broke the contract. That's the way I read the history and the way in which I make sense of the history. The general, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a strong commitment to believing in Shakespeare as a kind of natural, untutored genius. And one of the things that seemed to go along with this idea of genius was the idea that he wasn't a planner, he wasn't calculating, things came to him, including his brilliant inspirations. I think that one of the things we could tell about Shakespeare is he was a very intelligent man. And I think that it's more likely that he was intelligent enough to have learned from what happened to his father to know that he didn't want to replicate that life. It was almost unavoidable that he would have been apprenticed. In fact, there are records from the period, especially in a market town, where town governors are telling people that they have to make sure to get their children into apprenticeships. They're punished if they don't get their children set up in a place that's likely to prove to be remunerative, to establish them as solid citizens of the town, and so on. As his father's son, I think it's inevitable that Shakespeare would have been apprenticed. As I said, there are a couple of apocryphal records, oral history from the later 17th century, that the apprenticeship was with a butcher. It's possible that it could have been in some other trade. In a way, that's immaterial. What is material is that that's what he didn't do. He did not work out an apprenticeship. He did not train in any kind of field to live a life in Stratford as a mercantile member of society. He went to London. And, the way that makes sense to me is that Shakespeare figured out what he wanted to do and he figured out how to achieve it. Well, I think that I think there's no question that he did go to school. I think his works prove that he had the Latin grammar school training. Nicholas Rose said that he was in grammar school in Stratford. One thing to understand is that these schools were called free schools, and that means two things. One, they were free, which means that even his father could afford it. But two, they were designed for what are called free men. That is, for the children of free men. Free men were people who were licensed to trade in a town or in a city. And Shakespeare's father was a trader, 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 a merchant. So his children had the right to go to the school by virtue of the fact that he had his own business in Stratford. And there's no question but that he would have taken advantage of that opportunity, especially for his oldest son. We don't have Shakespeare's apprenticeship indentures. We don't have any apprenticeship indentures from that period. The first ones in Stratford are from the first decade of the 17th century. It's just that those records haven't survived. We don't have enrollment indentures. We don't have an enrollment records for the school. So a lot of this is just putting together what a life would have been like in this town. And it's a pattern that's borne out across the country. There are patterns that we see in the records for Stratford itself, knowing kind of what was probable and what was almost certain. Right. So let me just say about the beds, first of all, when I, took some examples of what a third best bed would look like. I mean, I read one will where a woman had 7 children and she gave first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh best beds. I mean, it was just an extremely common locution. The only thing the second best bed means that we know of is that it wasn't the best bed. And one of the things that people have speculated is that the best bed would have been reserved for the guest bedroom, and New Place was such a big house that it was used as a place for distinguished visitors who came to Stratford to stay in. So that's the distinguished visitors would have stayed in that guest bedroom and would have used that best bed. The second best bed is more likely to have been the family bed, and perhaps the bed that Shakespeare and Anne used. Wills are extremely various. It's pretty unusual to come across a will where somebody gives a list of books or even gives out specific books. A lot of people will say, I give my Bible to my son. And that means that that's a house where there's one book and it's a Bible. Shakespeare probably had more books, but he doesn't detail them. His son-in-law, Susanna's husband, John Hall, in his will did refer to a study of books in the house. So that would have probably been John Hall's books, but may also have included books that he had essentially inherited with the house from Shakespeare. Shakespeare just doesn't bother to mention it. I do have a theory about why Shakespeare mentioned the things he did, why he didn't mention the books, but he did mention a sword. The great kind of silence of Shakespeare's private life is that he had a son who died when he was very young, 13. Shakespeare had 3 children. Susanna was the firstborn. Then there were the twins, Judith and Hamnet. And unlike Ben Jonson, Shakespeare didn't write about the death of his son. He didn't write a poem about the death of his son. And people have always wondered, does that mean that he cared more? Does it mean that he cared less? Why hasn't he told us anything about the way he felt about losing his only son? And when I look at that small handful of specific objects that Shakespeare left, I wonder if each of them is somehow connected to the ghost of Hamnet. So he left his wearing apparel to his sister. As I said, she had sons. But Hamnet should have been the one who would grow up to wear those clothes, not his sister's sons. The sword that was a symbol of the fact that he was a gentleman, Hamnet should have inherited that sword. The silver gilt bowl that he gave to Judith, that was a common, especially for people who could afford it, baptismal gift. I wonder if that bowl didn't have something to do with the baptism of both Judith and Hamnet. And then there's the bed. Was that the bed in which Hamnet was born? Was that the bed in which Hamnet died? To me, Hamnet's the link between that very odd collection of things that he chose to mention. Well, first of all, you have to remember that wills are legal documents. So that what happened was that John Hall, Shakespeare's son-in-law, took Shakespeare's will, handwritten will, hand-signed will, to London in order to get it registered so that the will could be executed and everything could be probated. And Shakespeare did have a lot of property to deal with. The other thing that was really complicated for Shakespeare was the situation with Judith. His second daughter, Judith, had just married shortly before, but there was some question about the marriage. His other son-in-law, Thomas Quiney, and Judith were excommunicated in the course of all this. And when he wrote his will, I'm not sure that he could know for a fact that that marriage was going to be legitimated and that any children of that marriage would be considered legitimate in the church. So he had a whole lot of concerns about how to dispose of his money, how to dispose of his houses and lands in ways that protected all the women in his life. Anne was taken care of through dower law, but he had to make sure that things were divided between Susan and Judith. And I think Susanna and Judith, and I think it was a complicated process. So the first thing he had in mind was this is a legal document, and it has to stand up in a court of law if there are any challenges for his wishes to be seen through. If that's true, then when he's giving the second best bed, I think could be right. This is a private message. All those gifts could have been private messages, sentimental messages to the people who were mentioned, but they're almost subtextual because the basic business of the will has to be to make sure that everything's legally disposed of and protected. It was really common for people to express respect and fellowship with the gifts of rings. Those kind of gifts, and he gave out several rings. It wasn't just to Hemmings and Condell. Those kinds of rings are about a entirely different kind of relationship. When it's somebody that you want to honor as a kind of professional partner, or as especially if it's somebody who's your superior or so on, you never give out sentimental bequests like an old bed. It's always something new, a ring. So there's no sentiment at all in the gift of a ring. It's just a mark of respect and a kind of implicit request that you be remembered. You know, especially if you don't sell the ring immediately to trade it in to fund the first folio. If you wear it, remember me when you wear it. What happened in the late 17th century was that an antiquarian named William Dugdale wrote a big book called The Antiquities of Warwickshire. And he tried to record, he recorded an enormous amount of information, but he included a lot of information about monuments, including his own drawings of those monuments, which were translated for print by Wenceslas Haller. And he visited churches, he collected genealogical information. In this book, he included an illustration of Shakespeare's monument. Now, he was just a kind of obsessive collector of information. It's really remarkable how he was able to put all the pieces together and actually establish coherent narratives in the things that he published. But he left a little diary in which he made notes to himself and recorded that the person who had sculpted Shakespeare's monument was a man named Gerard Johnson. Now, that has been the accepted attribution for years. The fact is that there was a tomb maker named Gerard Johnson who moved to London in the late 16th century and established his business. He was dead by the time we got to Shakespeare's monument. He had two sons, one of which was named Nicholas and one of which was named for him, Gerard. There are no records of Gerard actually having a career as a tomb maker. Nicholas was a producing tomb maker during Shakespeare's life and at the time of Shakespeare's death. And Dugdale, who collected old manuscripts as well as all the other things that he did, had a record of immigrants or aliens who were living in London in the kind of early 17th century. And there was a listing for Gerard Johnson in that list of foreigners, because he had come from the Low Countries, Johnson, in that list of foreigners that referred to him as a tomb maker. I think that Dugdale, as was the case in some of his other records, was given the lead by someone that the sculptor for Shakespeare's tomb was a man named Johnson. He picked the name Gerard up from this list of London residents in the early 17th century. He, 40 years on, didn't know that Gerard Johnson had already died. Put in the name Gerard Johnson. We, knowing that Gerard Johnson had already died, thought, oh, it must have been Gerard Johnson's son, Gerard. I think that he just filled in the blank wrong in terms of the way he was putting information together, and that it's far more likely that it was Nicholas Johnson, who was, after all, a practicing tomb maker at the time of Shakespeare's final illness. Yeah, well, the way he would have gotten his grave located at what seems like the best place in the church is by paying a fee. He or some members of his family paid the fee to have those tombs placed, all those family tombs that are lined up in the church, his grave, his wife's grave, his daughter's grave, her husband's grave. Judith Quiney is not buried there, but she may have been, because some of the graves were kind of moved and replaced later on in the 17th century. I think that it's a different way of looking at Shakespeare in this respect. We have a kind of, somebody said to me, wouldn't it be nice to believe that like Shakespeare was celebrated by other people? And I think what he's getting at is the idea that we kind of like the thought of somebody being modest, of somebody letting others speak for him. I think Shakespeare was proud, and I don't think he had a kind of false sense of modesty, if it's true that he commissioned his own monument like this. And it's very hard to believe that anybody else could have commissioned it, because it was a pretty unusual type. As far as we know, there was nobody else taking mental notes about what kind of monument you might want to see. And it was, as I said, not uncommon for people to commission their own monuments. There was a preacher somewhere or other who built his monument, 7 years before he died. And he liked to stand, at the altar of the church, so that when he was delivering his sermons every Sunday, he was looking at himself up on the wall. It happened. People liked to kind of shape their image like that in afterlife. And there's a peculiarity about the inscription that suggests to me that the last line that's on the inscription plaque on his monument gives his date of death and his age at death. That could not have been filled in before he died, but it's put in a way that looks to me like it was something that was added later, so that everything was in place, just ready for that date of death to be put in when it happened. And so that to me kind of confirms the idea that it was already there. People have not assumed that Shakespeare designed his own monument, but they have said Susanna saw it, Judith saw it, Anne saw it. It was something that certainly the family knew and would seem to have thought was a good likeness and was a good representation of him. It's really characteristic of this particular kind of monument that it's really for a person's individual achievements. So all those men in Oxford whom Shakespeare was seeing monuments for up on the walls of the chapels, those men were married. Their monuments did not mention their wives. Lots of other monuments in the period, people listed the names of their children. They listed philanthropy that they had done. They listed charitable contributions that they had made. They had a very different kind of approach to what the monument is about. But those Oxford monuments were about, this is a person who accomplished a lot in his life. This is a person who was distinguished. And that's what I think Shakespeare's monument is about his achievement. And you're right, that it kind of goes in two directions, one of which is that he was a great writer, and one of the other of which was that he achieved financial success. He was a gentleman, and he had something to celebrate in that realm as well.
And there's no, are there any monuments of women?
Yeah, there are. And there are a couple of instances, later instances of women who are shown in the same way in those kind of half-height portraits. It eventually, that form was taken in directions that sometimes did include couples, a man and a woman, but that, that was later on. But yeah, there were. So that one of the, I was saying that these men at Oxford University had monuments to themselves that did not refer to their wives or to their family members. Well, there was the daughter of one of them, after her mother died, made sure that her mother had her own monument in a different church, so that her mother was remembered as well. There were an awful lot of people that we don't know where they were buried. And when Hamnet died, I don't know that Shakespeare was quite had the wherewithal to see that he had a special burial of that sort. There were a few monuments during this time period, 2 children who died young, but they're very, very rare. We don't know where Shakespeare's father's buried. We don't know whether his mother's buried. We don't know where his brothers are buried. I mean, there were an awful lot of people who were buried in ways that we will never recover, in places that we will never know. And that's true of Hamnet. We don't know where Hamnet was buried. Shakespeare's father, even when things were difficult for him, he did pay extra to have one of his daughters receive a little acknowledgement when she died. That was to have the bells rung for her, to have her coffin taken to the churchyard and so on. We don't know where that coffin was placed. I mean, that wasn't part of the kind of way in which you marked the death of somebody who wasn't going to be memorialized at this time. The focus, if you had any money at all, when somebody died, was to see them interred respectably in the churchyard, a procession taking the coffin, taking the body to the church, and so on. But that's kind of where that ended. I don't. There's been a lot of speculation about that. The only thing I think is that he probably knew he was dying. So I don't think, I mean, from the evidence of the will, he had a will. He rewrote it after Judith married to take into account her changed circumstances. And the fact that he did that, just the time, how close that was, suggests to me that he was getting everything in order in preparation for death. So I don't think he had a heart attack, for example. I don't think it was something sudden. Because I think he commissioned his monument, I think that was part of his awareness as well of his approaching death. Yeah, it's just a record of, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the date for it, but there was a woman who died who was named Catherine Hamnet. And, everybody, Hamlet, and everybody's, Hamlet or Hamnet or Hamlet, those names are interchangeable. People have been interested in this with the idea that that had something to do with the play of Hamlet, where a woman drowns. In this period, drownings were always kind of suspect. Was it accidental or was it suicide? And there were, coroner's courts that tried to figure out which it might be, because it made the difference in terms of, and this is an issue, of course, that comes up in Hamlet, in the play. It made a difference in terms of whether the body's buried in consecrated ground, as would be legitimate for someone who had an accident, or not, as would not be legitimate for somebody who had committed suicide. So it's just interesting to speculate and about how that might have informed the play. But one of the things I tried to do in this book was not to talk about the plays and the poems, because people have made so many connections between the life and the plays in ways that I don't think we can entirely justify. Where this was hardest for me actually was with respect to the play Hamlet. And it's not only because of the connection between the Hamlet and the Hamnet name. It's not only because of the drowning of Catherine Hamnet. It's also because of his monument. One of the things I didn't talk about a lot is that above his sculpture, there's a kind of pediment that shows his coat of arms, celebrating the fact that he's a gentleman. On either side of the coat of arms are two little putti, two little cherubs, and they're shown as grave diggers. And they're resting, having dug their graves. They're sitting, and they're sitting on little mounds of dirt. And one of them is sitting on a little mound of dirt, and what he's dug up in that dirt that he's been working is a skull. So I can't help but think about the skull of Yorick coming up in the play of Hamlet. But, as I said, I decided to avoid making those kind of connections. So I didn't follow that. It was a project that was a lot of fun. So that when I didn't intend to write about or even research Shakespeare's monument, but I started going to churches and looking at monuments and seeing things that looked familiar, seeing things that didn't. That was a great project, traveling around little churches in England. And I also had a lot of fun working in the archives. I told you about Elizabeth Quiney, who's a woman whose records I came across. It was great fun to kind of piece her career together in the papers of the Stratford, the town records. What I think that, as I've said to you, a lot of what I have done here is, although I've always gone back to old sources, I'm also speculating on the meaning of those sources. I can't prove that Shakespeare was apprenticed as a butcher. I can't prove that this was the way he broke his apprenticeship. I can't prove that he commissioned his own monument, because we don't have direct records about these. All I can do is put together pieces in ways that seem to me to make sense, and hope that they'll make sense to other people, and hope also that they'll give us a different perspective, not only on Shakespeare and his personality, but also on his relationship with his wife and with other members of his family. That said, there's still an awful lot out there. I mean, one of the things that I hope people will take away is that there's good stuff to be found in the records of early modern England, and hope that other people will find other new things and other new ways of interpreting those documents if they give them a chance.
Well, thank you so much, Lina. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for supporting the activities at the festival.
I admire it so much. I just am so grateful, and, as I said, honored to have an opportunity to take part in it in any way, because this is a fabulous project. Thank you so much.